What followed in the West after the Civil War was traditionally called the Indian Wars. More recently, since the 1990s, scholars have looked at what happened and said that wasn't a war. It was called a war to help justify it, to imply that it was a battle between equals, to make it seem like the Americans were justified in this battle in the same way that they had been justified in the Civil War. But when you look at it, it was a bunch of skirmishes and massacres against people who were fighting for their communities and for their lives, and very often people who wanted to live in peace, who did not want to engage in these military actions, and the United States forced them into it. Throughout these decades, all Native Americans were methodically suppressed. There are variations, and we will talk about some of the variations of what each tribe experienced, but overall they fit into a large pattern. First, the natives would be forced into agreeing to treaties that pushed them onto reservations, and the reservations themselves tended to shrink over time as land was taken away for various reasons. If they left the reservation, they were declared outlaws and were subject to military force. And once they were subject to military force, they would be defeated by the military. It happens again and again and again. The Sioux. The Sioux fought, generally speaking, the Sioux are a very large group of people who share a common culture with some variations. And the Sioux fought very hard to maintain their land and their culture. In 1851, they signed the Fort Laramie Treaty at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and their understanding of that treaty was that it acknowledged their territorial claims. They said, we have all this land in the Dakotas and Wyoming, and that is ours. And they believed that the Europeans acknowledged that territory in 1851. In later treaties, the Sioux couldn't figure out why they had this one treaty, and they kept being asked to sign more treaties that took away more land. In the 1860s, the peace policy created a division between reservation Sioux and off-reservation Sioux. At that point, a lot of the different cultural groups, so the Oglala, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Hunkpapa, those distinctions get muddled up into this larger division of simply reservation or off-reservation. In this confusion of kind of reorganizing who's going to be on the reservation, those that are refusing to live on the reservation, in the middle 1870s, many of the Sioux families and bands began to gravitate to Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was a holy man. He's not exactly a religious leader, but he was seen as a visionary and a wise leader. And so while he's officially the leader of the Hunkpapa, he becomes the unofficial leader of all of the off-reservation Sioux. And by 1876, about 4,000 people have gravitated to him. This gathering of the Sioux near the Little Bighorn, or a place that's called Greasy Grass by the Sioux themselves, this very large gathering of Native Americans made the United States cavalry very nervous. They couldn't figure out why these people would be gathering if it wasn't for war. Remember that they expect the natives to be hostile. And so when they see them gathering, they don't think maybe they're having a religious gathering, maybe it's for trade. Their automatic thought is that they are a military threat. In this large gathering where they were singing and worshiping, Sitting Bull had a vision, and it was a fairly extensive vision. it included seeing United States soldiers falling from the sky. And in sharing this vision, it was interpreted as being a tremendous victory over the United States Army. Taking that vision combined with the real Sioux propensity to never back away from a fight. When General George Custer, who was a Civil War hero, led soldiers in to attack and break up this Sioux gathering, Crazy Horse jumped into the lead and led the Sioux warriors against the cavalry and wiped them out, killed General Custer, killed all of his men. And it was a great victory for the Sioux at that moment. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is a high point for their military activities against the United States. But the United States, of course, wasn't going to let this stand, and Custer was elevated as a tremendous hero instead of a hot-headed idiot. He was presented as a martyr, and the United States Army began to actively pursue Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and their followers. Crazy Horse was killed while he was being arrested a few years later. Sitting Bull was able to lead his people to some safety in Canada for a while, but eventually in returning to their homelands, they were caught at Wounded Knee and massacred in 1890. And that was the effective end of Sioux resistance against United States settlements. The Nez Perce had a different approach. Remember that the Nez Perce are not, they are not warlike, but they were very good warriors. When the Nez Perce Reservation was established in 1863, the southern portion of Nez Perce territory was left out, and this was the group of Nez Perce who were led by Chief Joseph. And the Nez Perce's interpretation of the treaty and the reservation was that it was fine for the Nez Perce to keep living where they were living as long as they were peaceful. They didn't quite register that the United States thought they were hostile simply by not being on the reservation. So for several years, Chief Joseph and his followers simply continued to live in the same place, even though the reservation had been established away from where they were living. Within that community, a religion that today we call the Dreamer religion was gaining a foothold not only among the Nez Perce, but among other Native American tribes in the region. And this was a religion that simply supported traditional Nez Perce communities. It was a religion of dancing and prayer and chanting that promoted peace, but was seen as threatening by European communities. European communities were never able to distinguish between what was a simple religious gathering and what was preparation for war. So as the Dreamer religion is gaining more and more people to it, the Europeans living near them are getting more and more anxious because, again, they see a gathering of Native Americans and they think they must be preparing for war. In 1876, as this Dreamer religion has been gaining ground, the Nez Perce encounter more conflicts with their neighbors, and the United States cavalry comes in to see what's going on, what's this conflict going on. And while the Nez Perce try to avoid a fight, in the end, when the fight is brought to them, they fight back and they make fools of the cavalry. And you see this several times over several months. The cavalry keep trying to attack the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce make fools of them and escape. But the Nez Perce don't want to have an all-out conflict in the same way that the Sioux did. And so Chief Joseph decides he's going to take his people and find a place where they can live in peace. They traveled for 1,700 miles. They left this region just south of the reservation and traveled across modern-day Montana and south through what is today Yellowstone National Park, and then to the north. They were attempting to meet up with Sitting Bull and his people, and finally, after traveling almost 2,000 miles, they surrendered here just before they could get to Canada. At that point, Chief Joseph gave a very moving speech to the United States Army, talking about his children starving, his warriors dying, and his own surrender, of saying that he would give in to what the Americans asked, and he would fight no more forever. They were at first imprisoned in Missouri and eventually were allowed to return to eastern Washington, to something close to their original homeland. And finally, the Apache. By the 1870s, most of the Apache had been secured on reservations in Arizona. The Apache were never a threat to the United States Army because they existed in these small groups that tended to fight with one another. They were fighting over resources in the desert and did not have an opportunity to come together under one charismatic leader the way that the Nez Perce and the Sioux did. So they were largely on reservations by the 1870s, some cooperating with the Army and others fighting against them. There's a period from 1881 to 1886 that is generously called the Apache War. What it really was Geronimo left a reservation, attacked and raided the Army and Mexican settlements, stealing horses, stealing food. He was followed by about 70 warriors and women and children who went with the warriors. His group never numbered more than about 350 people. The reason that they were able to stretch out this Apache war for so long was that they were skipping back and forth from the United States to Mexico. So because there were questions of jurisdiction and where the United States Army could go, where the Mexican Army could go, Geronimo and his group could go raid a settlement and then skip across the border and avoid the Army for a period of time until they decided to go back in the other direction. It's not something that really deserves the name of war. It was somebody carrying out raids against communities in the same way that the Apache and the Comanche had for centuries. Geronimo was simply doing it very late in the story. Geronimo was ultimately captured by the United States Army. He and his followers were then sent to reservations in Florida. Geronimo himself became this stereotype of the wild Indian that can't be suppressed. But he was not a hero to his people. Other than the people who were following him, I just don't feel like anybody liked him very much. Very different from people like Crazy Horse that were widely respected by their people. The upshot of all this was the loss of most Native American land in the United States. What you see on the map in front of you now is Native land is the blue in 1862, and the brown is the reservations. I'll run this video and you can see how land was taken from the natives over the course of the entire United States history. The United States strategy against Native Americans was not only a matter of taking the land from them. As I said a little bit earlier, the overall goal of United States policy was to erase Native Americans, and that meant not only taking their land and forcing them onto reservations, but changing their traditional way of life into something that looked like a traditional European American way of life. Most important in this was shifting to a European style economic model, which universally meant farming. You see this over and over and over again, that they want to turn Native Americans into farmers. And never mind that many Native Americans had engaged in agriculture long before the Europeans showed up. What the Europeans wanted to see was European-style agriculture being carried out on the reservations. And never mind that so many of these reservations were on marginal land that was not suited for agriculture. That didn't matter. To be quote-unquote civilized meant to be farmers. And so that's what they pushed onto Native Americans all over the country on every single reservation. When the farming failed, they became dependent on government support. Many of the treaties had promised if Native Americans gave up hunting, the federal government would feed them. They did, but they fed them poorly, they fed them irregularly, and further undercut Native American culture by separating them from their traditional foodways. The United States also worked to separate Native Americans from their culture by separating children from their families. Sometimes parents were convinced to give up their children to boarding schools. In other cases, children were forcibly taken away from their parents. Once they were taken to the boarding schools, their traditional clothing, their traditional hairstyles were taken from them. They were prohibited from speaking their native languages. They were introduced to Christianity if they were not already Christian. The very firm belief was that Americans could take Native Americans away from their Native American parents, and they would erase the Native Americanness from them. The most damage done by the boarding school practice was certainly to the individual children, the children who were separated from their families and their traditions. It was also a devastating loss of language for Native American communities. The children were forced to not speak their native languages. They were forced to speak English. Many of them returned home after they had finished school and never recovered the language. And so the richness of a language that reflects a community and a landscape was lost in hundreds of communities around the United States. The upshot of the treatment of the United States of Native Americans was incredible poverty and disease around Native American communities. Reservations were always placed on land that the Europeans didn't want because it was not profitable. The Native Americans were promised government aid that never arrived. They were limited to reservations and then vilified because they couldn't find jobs, because they couldn't support themselves in a location where there were no jobs, where there was no ability to support themselves or their families. They were given ready access to alcohol and then condemned when they became alcoholic in these desperate situations. The reservation system of the 1850s and the 1860s translates directly into the poverty and disorder that exists on so many Native American reservations today. In the 1970s, as the African American civil rights movement was developing, a similar Native American rights movement grew, called the American Indian Movement. That movement was a starting point for a resurgence of Native American cultures in the United States. Since that time, there's been a movement toward language recovery. So some of you may have experienced Mohawk language instruction in high school. In many communities, this recovery of the language that has actually been threatened by the pandemic in 2020, which threatens the very elderly native speakers of the language. And so in many places in both North and South America, there's a race to try and reclaim and recapture the language before elders pass away. What we have seen in our own day in the 1990s and the 2000s is a reclaiming of ethnic pride, of perhaps someone like me being proud of being a Scottish American, of people being proud of being Haitian Americans, of people who are proud of their African American heritage that goes back to the colonial period. Ethnic pride is encouraged in the modern day, and Native Americans are not excluded from that. So in the current decade, more than any time in my memory, it's acceptable and encouraged for people to say proudly, I'm Huron, I'm Mohawk, I'm Lakota, I'm Dene, I belong to one of these communities. Even more remarkably, in the last 10 years, Native Americans have been successful in defending their treaty rights and their rights to their own lands. You might remember the defense of land against having oil pipelines crossing it, which brought together Native Americans and others from all across the United States, saying that the natives had a right to determine what happens on their own land. Very recently, the United States Supreme Court found that most of Oklahoma is still technically Indian land because an old treaty was never nullified, and therefore natives still own huge chunks of Oklahoma. So in all of these ways, Native Americans, after 4 centuries of European Americans trying to suppress them, trying to make them vanish, it's very clear that they didn't vanish, that they are still a vital and important part of the United States today. And that's really a moment to end the last lecture of this course. The United States is a really fantastic country. There's so much to offer and so much vibrancy, but that strength comes from the huge variety of people, the disparate, different stories that exist in the United States history. It's not just a story of white men coming and oppressing everybody else. The United States is made up of all of these different stories, stories of conflict, stories of hope, some stories of cruelty, stories of kindness, that to really understand the United States, we need to know all of these different stories, all of these different people. We can't ever tell just one people's story because they all intersect and interact. And that's what makes this really amazing country that we live in.